The coast was wild then, a jagged edge where land met an endless gray ocean under skies that had never known the smoke of cities. Waves crashed against black rocks worn smooth by 10,000 years of patient erosion, each tide older than memory itself. This was the world of the coastal foragers, people who lived between stone and sea in an age we call the Mesolithic. Not just survivors in a harsh landscape, but masters of a realm where others would have starved within days of arrival. What if you could smell the salt air they breathed? Feel the cold spray on your face as they did. Somewhere along this ancient shoreline, smoke was curling upward from wet wood, a signal that humans had learned to command fire. The last ice age had retreated only a few thousand years before, leaving behind a transformed world of rising seas and drowning valleys. Forests crept northward across lands once buried beneath glaciers to miles thick, and the people followed, always following the changing edge. These were not the first humans to walk these shores, but they were among the most adaptable our species had ever produced. They carried with them tools of flint and bone, knowledge passed down through countless generations, and an intimate understanding of the tides. The ocean was their garden, their hunting ground, their highway connecting settlements scattered along hundreds of miles of coastline. Like beads on a string, at low tide, they walked out onto exposed mudflats where shellfish lay buried just beneath the surface, waiting to be harvested by knowing hands. At high tide, they set traps woven from willow branches, capturing fish that came seeking shelter in the shallow waters near the shore. But fire was the key to everything. The difference between survival and slow starvation in a world still cold. From the ice's long embrace, wood does not burn easily, and the coastal climate was relentless with its moisture, its fog, its endless drizzle from low clouds. Yet every morning, smoke rose from their camps, thin columns of gray that spoke of persistence, skill, and the refusal to surrender to the elements. How did they coax flame from wood that wept with seawater and rain, that seemed determined never to catch fire at all? The answer lay in their knowledge of bark and resin, of the dry hardwood hidden inside logs that looked soaked through to the core. They split the driftwood carefully with stone axes, revealing the protected center that had stayed dry even as the outer layers rotted and softened. They gathered birch bark, which burns even when wet, and pine resin that drips like amber tears and ignites with fierce, sustaining heat. The fire was never allowed to die completely, for starting a new flame from scratch was difficult work requiring patience and perfect conditions. Instead, they carried embers in shells lined with moss, or in hollow horns packed with smoldering fungus that could keep a coal alive for hours. When they made camp, their first task was always the same: build the fire, feed it carefully, bring it back to life from the fragile spark they had carried. Around these fires, families gathered as darkness fell, the flames pushing back the night and the cold that came creeping in from the water. Children learned the stories of their ancestors, tales of great hunts and terrible storms, of the time before the ice retreated and the world was different. Elders taught the young where to find the best flint, how to read the weather and the color of the dawn, when the seals would come to the rocks to bear their young. The smoke that curled from wet wood carried the smell of cooking shellfish, of roasting fish wrapped in kelp, of seal meat sizzling on hot stones beside the coals. It was the smell of home in a world without permanent houses, without walls or roofs, where shelter was a hide stretched over bent branches and hope. These people moved with the seasons, following the salmon runs upriver in autumn, returning to the coast when winter storms made inland travel treacherous and uncertain. They left behind shell middens, great mounds of discarded oyster and mussel shells mixed with ash and bone, monuments to thousands of meals eaten over generations. Archaeologists would find these middens 10,000 years later, excavating them layer by layer like reading the pages of an ancient book written in refuse. In those layers, they would find the story of a people intimately connected to the rhythms of the sea, to the cycles of abundance and scarcity. But in that ancient present, The foragers knew nothing of archaeology or the distant future, only the immediate demands of survival and the comfort of fire. The wet wood hissed and popped as moisture trapped inside turned to steam, each sound a small victory against the dampness that tried to extinguish every flame. Smoke rose in irregular pulses, sometimes thick and white, sometimes thin and nearly invisible against the gray sky that seemed to press down upon the world. Other groups along the coast would see that smoke and know that this stretch of shoreline was claimed, that resources here were being used by people with prior rights. It was a language without words, a signal that spoke of presence and possession, of community and the invisible boundaries that kept the peace between neighboring bands. Sometimes the smoke brought visitors, travelers who approached the fire with open hands and gifts of flint or ochre, seeking news and temporary shelter from the cold. Sometimes it brought nothing but the wind, which scattered the smoke across the water and carried it out to sea, where no human eye would ever follow. The foragers understood that they were part of something larger than themselves, a web of relationships that connected every living thing along the coast. The seals they hunted were not just meat and blubber, but fellow creatures who shared the same waters, who breathed the same air, who felt the same cold. The fish they caught were gifts from the ocean, and the ocean demanded respect, for it could give life one day and take it away the next with a single storm. When they took a seal, they returned the bones to the water, a gesture of gratitude and recognition that the hunt was a sacred exchange, not simple theft. When they gathered shellfish, they left the smallest ones to grow, ensuring that there would be food in the seasons yet to come for their children and grandchildren. This was not conservation as we understand it today, but something deeper, an intuitive understanding that waste was a form of suicide spread across generations. The smoke from their fires rose into a sky that had witnessed the birth of agriculture in distant lands. But these people had no need for farming yet. The sea provided everything they required, and the forests behind them offered deer and wild boar, hazelnuts and berries, mushrooms and edible roots in their proper seasons. Why plant seeds and tend crops when the world itself was already a garden? If only you knew where to look and when to harvest. But the world was changing, slowly and inexorably, as the climate warmed and sea levels continued their relentless rise, drowning the old coastlines beneath new waves. Settlements that had stood for generations found themselves too close to the water, then in the water, then lost forever beneath the advancing tide. The foragers moved inland, adapting once again as they had always adapted. But something was being lost with each abandoned camp, each submerged shell midden. What if those lost sites could speak to us now, tell us their stories of resilience and change, of people who thrived in a world we can barely imagine, not just primitive survivors clinging to existence, but sophisticated hunters and gatherers with rich cultures, complex social structures, and deep spiritual lives we can only glimpse through fragments. The smoke from their fires has long since dispersed, scattered by 10,000 years of wind, but the memory of it remains in the archaeological record they left behind, in the charcoal layers of their hearths, in the burned bones of seals and fish, in the fire-cracked stones they used to boil water in hide containers that have rotted away. Modern scientists can analyze that charcoal and determine what species of wood they burned, what temperatures their fires reached, even what season the wood was cut. They can extract ancient DNA from the shells and bones, reconstructing the marine ecosystems these people depended on with astonishing precision and unexpected detail. They can study the patterns of settlement and abandonment, mapping how the foragers responded to rising seas and changing coastlines over thousands of years of continuous occupation. But no amount of scientific analysis can truly capture what it felt like to be there, to smell that smoke curling from wet wood on a cold morning by the sea, to know that your survival depended on your ability to make fire in a world that seemed designed to extinguish it at every opportunity and every moment, to understand the ocean not as a recreational space or a source of industrial seafood, but as a living entity that demanded respect and gave life in return. The coastal foragers lived in what we call the Mesolithic, the Middle Stone Age, a period that lasted roughly from 10,000 to 6,000 years ago in northern Europe. It was a time of transition between the nomadic hunter-gatherers of the Paleolithic and the settled farmers who would come later with their domesticated animals and planted fields. But for the foragers themselves, it was not a transition or a middle period, but simply the world as it had always been and always would be. They could not have imagined that within a few thousand years, their way of life would be almost entirely replaced by agriculture, that their descendants would forget how to read the tides. They could not have known that their shell middens would become archaeological treasures, windows into a vanished world that modern people would study with wonder and a touch of envy. The smoke rose and dispersed, day after day, year after year, century after century, an unbroken chain of fire maintained across generations without number, until one day it stopped, because the people moved on, or the sea rose too high, or new ways of living made the old knowledge unnecessary and obsolete. The last fire went out, the last column of smoke dissolved into the air, and the coastal foraging life that had sustained humans for thousands of years began its slow fade into history. But before it ended, there were countless mornings when someone coaxed flame from wet wood, when smoke curled upward into the gray dawn, when life continued despite the cold and damp. There were children who learned to split driftwood and find the dry heart, who learned which bark burned best, who learned to carry fire in a shell lined with moss. There were elders who remembered when the coastline was different, when certain islands were still connected to the mainland, when the fishing was better in places now drowned by the rising sea. There were artists who carved patterns into bone and antler, creating beauty for its own sake in a world where every calorie was hard-won, and every day was a struggle. There were lovers who met by firelight, who made promises and broke them, who created the next generation that would carry on the knowledge and the struggle and the smoke. All of this happened in the shadow of the retreating ice, in a world still adjusting to warmth after 100,000 years of glacial cold and frozen silence. The coastal foragers were not living in a pristine wilderness untouched by human hands, but in a landscape they had shaped through millennia of burning, hunting, and harvesting. They managed the forests with fire, creating clearings that attracted deer and promoted the growth of hazel trees, whose nuts they gathered in enormous quantities each autumn. They altered the composition of shellfish populations through their harvesting patterns, preferentially taking certain species and leaving others, slowly changing the ecology of the intertidal zone. They were not separate from nature but part of it, agents of change who shaped their world even as it shaped them, in an endless dance of mutual influence. When farmers finally arrived with their sheep and cattle, their wheat and barley, the foragers did not simply vanish or die out as older histories once suggested. Instead, they adapted once more, incorporating new foods and new technologies into their existing knowledge base, becoming something new while retaining something old and essential. Some continue to live primarily from the sea, fishing and gathering as their ancestors had, but now trading their catch for grain and pottery and metal tools from farming communities. Others gradually adopted agriculture themselves, though they never entirely abandoned the coast or forgot the skills that had sustained their people for so many generations before. The smoke from wetwood became smoke from hearths in permanent houses, from cooking fires that burned domesticated wood from managed forests, from kilns and forges and furnaces. But somewhere in the genetic memory of their descendants, there remained an echo of those ancient mornings, of the skill required to make fire in impossible conditions, of the comfort of smoke rising into a gray sky. Today, we can visit the places where they lived, walk the same beaches, though the coastline has changed and the sea has risen several meters since their time. We can see the shell middens, some of them enormous mounds that took thousands of years to accumulate, now protected as archaeological sites and cultural heritage monuments. We can hold in our hands the tools they made, the flint blades and bone harpoons, the net weights and fish hooks, feeling the same shapes their fingers knew so well. We can analyze the isotopes in their bones and determine that they ate a diet rich in marine protein, that they depended on the ocean for most of their sustenance throughout their lives. But we cannot smell the smoke from their fires, cannot hear their voices telling stories around the flames, cannot know what they believed about the world and their place in it. We can only imagine, guided by the fragments they left behind, by the patterns archaeologists have painstakingly reconstructed from thousands of excavations across the coastal regions of Europe. And in imagining, we might recognize something of ourselves in them, something that persists despite 10,000 years of change and progress and forgetting, the same need for warmth and light in the darkness, the same desire to gather with others around a fire, the same satisfaction in overcoming nature's obstacles through skill and knowledge, the same smoke curling upward from wet wood, defying the dampness, carrying with it the smell of home and the promise of another day survived, another night kept at bay. Have you ever tried to start a fire with wet wood, felt the frustration, and then the triumph when the flames finally catch and hold? That small victory connects you across the centuries to people who faced the same challenge every day, who could not afford to fail because failure meant cold and hunger and darkness. The coastal foragers are gone now. Their way of life vanished into the past, but the smoke they made still lingers in the archaeological record. In the charcoal we can date and analyze, and in that smoke we can read a story of human resilience, of adaptation and survival, of people who lived in harmony with a world that was neither gentle nor forgiving. They left us no written records, no monuments of stone, no great cities or empires, only shell middens and fire-cracked rocks and the faint traces of their camps along ancient shorelines. But in those humble remains lies a profound lesson about what it means to be human, to persist, to make smoke curl from wet wood against all odds, to survive and even thrive at the edge of the world.